The pool shimmers under the blazing sun as Karen Matthews storms across the deck, her designer sunglasses glinting with righteous fury. She's about to unleash hell on the undesirable family splashing in her exclusive community pool. But when she demands to see the property deed, her perfectly manicured world is about to shatter. Because the quiet man she's been screaming at, he's not just another resident. He's the one person who can destroy everything she's built her entitled life upon. And in 20 seconds, Karen is about to learn that some battles you simply cannot win. The chlorine-scented air hung thick over Willowbrook Estate's pristine community pool as Karen Matthews adjusted her wide-brimmed hat and surveyed her domain. At 43, she had cultivated the perfect image of suburban authority. Immaculate blonde highlights, yoga-toned physique displayed in a designer one-piece, and the kind of confidence that came from years of getting her way through sheer force of personality. The Homeowners Association meeting minutes were still fresh in her mind from last night's gathering. As HOA president for the third consecutive year, she'd successfully pushed through stricter pool regulations, increased guest fees, and implemented a new community standards policy that would finally restore order to their exclusive neighborhood. Everything was perfect until she heard them. Splashing, laughter, the unmistakable sound of children having too much fun. Karen's jaw tightened as she turned toward the deep end. A Hispanic family had claimed the prime poolside real estate. 2 lounge chairs and a small table laden with what appeared to be homemade food. The father, a lean man in his 40s with graying temples, was teaching his daughter to dive while his wife cheered from the pool's edge. Their teenage son was doing cannonballs that sent water splashing dangerously close to other sunbathers. "Absolutely not," Karen muttered, rising from her chair with the fluid motion of someone accustomed to taking charge. She strode across the concrete deck, her flip-flops slapping an authoritative rhythm. The family's joy grated against her nerves like nails on a chalkboard. This was exactly the kind of chaos she'd been elected to prevent. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cutting through the peaceful afternoon like a blade. "Excuse me!" The father looked up from the pool, water dripping from his dark hair. His wife, a petite woman with kind eyes, glanced over with a welcoming smile that only irritated Karen further. "Yes?" the man said, his accent barely noticeable. "Can we help you?" Karen positioned herself at the pool's edge, casting a shadow over the family like a storm cloud. "I'm Karen Matthews, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Are you residents here?" The man's expression remained calm, though something flickered in his dark eyes. "We are." "I'll need to see proof of residency," Karen continued, pulling out her phone as if she were conducting official business. "We've had issues with unauthorized pool usage, and I'm required to verify that all families using the facilities are legitimate homeowners." The woman in the pool exchanged a glance with her husband. Their daughter, perhaps 10 years old, had stopped mid-stroke and was now clinging to the pool's edge, sensing the tension that had suddenly thickened the air. "Mommy, what's wrong?" the girl whispered in Spanish. "Nothing, mija," the woman replied softly, but her eyes never left Karen's face. The father, Miguel, his wife had called him, slowly made his way to the pool's ladder. Water cascaded from his athletic frame as he climbed out, and Karen found herself taking an involuntary step back. There was something about his presence, a quiet authority that made her feel suddenly uncertain. "Is there a problem?" Miguel asked, his voice level but with an edge that hadn't been there before. Karen lifted her chin, drawing on years of committee meetings and neighborhood disputes. "The problem is that we have rules here. This isn't a public pool, it's a private community amenity for residents only, and we've been having issues with people who don't belong here taking advantage of our facilities. And you assume we don't belong here because—" Miguel's wife had joined them now, wrapping a towel around her waist but keeping her shoulders squared. Karen's lips curved into a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "I'm not assuming anything. I'm simply doing my job as HOA president. I know most of the homeowners in this community, and I haven't seen your family before. Maybe that's because you don't know everyone as well as you think you do," the teenage son said, hauling himself out of the pool with the kind of fluid confidence that only comes from years of swimming. "Mateo," his father warned quietly, "Karen's face flushed. I don't appreciate that tone, young man. I've lived in this community for 8 years and have been HOA president for 3. I take my responsibilities very seriously. As do I, Miguel said, and something in his voice made Karen pause. She studied his face more carefully. He was handsome in a weathered way, with the kind of tan that came from working outdoors rather than lounging by pools. His hands were calloused, his wedding ring simple gold. Everything about him screamed blue-collar worker, which only reinforced her suspicions. Look, Karen said, softening her tone as if speaking to a child. I'm sure you're very nice people, but we have rules for a reason. This community has property values to maintain, and part of that means ensuring our amenities aren't overused or abused. If you could just show me your homeowner documentation, we can clear this up quickly. Miguel's wife, Elena, he'd called her, stepped closer to her husband. We don't have to show you anything, she said quietly. We have every right to be here. Karen's patience, already stretched thin, snapped completely. Actually, you do have to show me. I have the authority to request proof of residency from anyone using community facilities. It's in the HOA bylaws, which every homeowner received when they purchased their property. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her contacts. If you can't provide documentation, I'll have to call security and have you removed from the premises. The family's youngest daughter had climbed out of the pool and was now pressed against her mother's side, her dark eyes wide with confusion and fear. The sight of the child's distress should have given Karen pause, but instead, it only fueled her sense of righteous indignation. This is harassment, Mateo said, his voice rising. We're not doing anything wrong. You're trespassing, Karen shot back. And your attitude is exactly why we have these policies in place. Miguel held up a hand, and his family immediately quieted. The gesture was subtle but undeniably authoritative, and Karen found herself momentarily speechless. Mrs. Matthews, he said, his voice deadly calm, I'm going to give you one opportunity to apologize to my family and walk away from this situation. Karen's eyes widened. The audacity was breathtaking. Apologize? For doing my job? For protecting this community? She laughed, a sharp sound that echoed off the pool deck. I think you have this backwards. You're the ones who need to leave. Papa, the little girl whispered, tugging on her father's arm. I want to go home. Elena knelt beside her daughter, whispering reassurances in Spanish, but her eyes blazed with a fury that made Karen take another step back. You know what? Karen said, her voice rising to carry across the pool area. Other residents had begun to notice the commotion, and she was acutely aware of her audience. I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting tonight. This kind of situation is exactly why we need stricter enforcement of our community standards. She began dialing a number, but Miguel's next words stopped her cold. Before you make that call, he said, his voice carrying an unmistakable note of warning, you might want to check your property records more carefully. Karen's finger hovered over her phone screen. What's that supposed to mean? Miguel's smile was slow, deliberate, and absolutely terrifying in its quiet confidence. It means, Mrs. Matthews, that you're about to make the biggest mistake of your life. The pool deck fell silent, except for the gentle lapping of water against the sides. Even the other families had stopped their conversations, sensing the electric tension that crackled between the two adults. Karen's heart began to race, though she couldn't quite say why. There was something in Miguel's expression, a certainty, that made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff she couldn't see. I don't know what game you're playing, she said, her voice wavering slightly, but I'm not intimidated by threats. No threats, Miguel replied, pulling out his own phone. Just facts. Would you like me to call the property management company? Or maybe you'd prefer to speak with the primary landowner directly. Karen's blood ran cold. The primary landowner? Miguel's smile widened, and in that moment, Karen Matthews realized she had just picked a fight with the wrong man. Let me introduce myself properly, he said, extending his hand with mock formality. Miguel Herrera, I own this land, Mrs. Matthews, all of it, including the house you've been living in for the past 8 years. The world tilted sideways. Karen's phone slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered onto the concrete, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Because impossible as it seemed, she could see the truth written clearly in Miguel Herrera's eyes. And she was about to learn that some assumptions come with a price that destroys everything you thought you knew about your perfect little world. Karen's world had tilted so violently that she felt physically nauseous. The pristine pool deck beneath her feet suddenly felt like quicksand, and the carefully constructed reality she'd built over 8 years was crumbling with each passing second. "That's impossible," she whispered, though even as the words left her lips, she knew they sounded pathetic. Her voice cracked like a teenager's, and she hated herself for the weakness. Miguel's expression remained maddeningly calm. "Is it? Tell me, Mrs. Matthews. Have you ever wondered why your rent checks go to Herrera Property Management instead of directly to a bank or mortgage company?" The blood drained from Karen's face. She had wondered, actually. Years ago, when she'd first moved in, she'd questioned the property management arrangement. But the house had been perfect, the neighborhood pristine, and the rent reasonable for such an upscale community. She'd convinced herself it was just a wealthy owner's way of avoiding the hassle of direct tenant management. "You're lying," she said, but her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Elena Herrera stepped forward, her protective instincts for her family, temporarily overridden by something that looked remarkably like pity. "Miguel, maybe we should—" "No." His voice was quiet but absolute. "She wants to see documentation. She'll get it." Miguel pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be a well-organized digital filing system. "Here we are. Willowbrook Estates, developed 2019 through 2022. Primary landowner and developer, Miguel Herrera, Herrera Property Management, LLC. He turned the screen toward Karen, and she found herself staring at official documents that made her stomach drop to her knees. Property deeds, development permits, architectural plans, all bearing Miguel's name and signature. "This can't be right," Karen stammered, but she was already remembering dozens of small details that suddenly made horrifying sense. The way the maintenance crews always seemed to know Miguel when they passed him on the street. How he'd always been friendly with the groundskeepers, speaking to them in rapid Spanish while she'd assumed he was just another laborer. The property management company had always been responsive to her complaints, but now she remembered how they'd sometimes seemed to already know about issues before she'd reported them. How they'd mentioned consulting with the owner about major decisions, though she'd never met this mysterious figure. 8 years, Miguel continued, his voice gaining strength. 8 years you've been living in my house, using my pool, walking, on my streets and treating my family like we don't belong here. Karen's legs felt weak. She grabbed the back of a nearby lounge chair for support, her knuckles white against the aluminum frame. "But the HOA, I'm the president of an association that exists at my discretion," Miguel interrupted. "Did you ever read the fine print of your lease agreement, Mrs. Matthews? The part about community governance being subject to the landowner's ultimate authority?" She hadn't. God help her. She'd skimmed the legal documents, focusing only on the rent, amount, and move-in date. The idea that someone else held ultimate power over her perfect little kingdom had never occurred to her. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "All these years, why didn't you tell anyone?" Miguel's expression softened slightly, but not with kindness, with disappointment. "Because I believed in letting the community govern itself. I thought people could be trusted to treat each other with basic human decency." The words hit Karen like physical blows. She thought of every HOA meeting, every rule she'd pushed through, every time she'd wielded her authority like a weapon. The community standards she'd been so proud of, the guest restrictions, the parking regulations that had driven out families who couldn't afford multiple cars. "How many?" she asked, dreading the answer. "How many what?" "How many families? Have you watched me?" She couldn't finish the sentence. Miguel's jaw tightened. "The Johnsons. Remember them. The young black couple with the baby? You filed noise complaints every time the baby cried outside. They moved out after 6 months because you made their lives hell. Karen's mouth went dry. She remembered the Johnsons. Sweet people, but they'd been disruptive to the neighborhood's peace. The Patels, Elena added quietly, her voice carrying years of suppressed anger. You tried to ban their cultural celebrations because the music was too loud and the food smells were inappropriate. The Washingtons, Mateo chimed in, his teenage voice cracking with emotion. You made Mr. Washington move his work truck because it lowered property values, even though he was the nicest man ever. He worked construction and had to park 6 blocks away every night. Karen felt sick. She remembered each family, each issue she'd addressed with such righteous determination. At the time, she'd felt like a crusader for community standards. Now she was beginning to see the pattern she'd been blind to. You watched, she said, her voice hollow. You watched me do all of that, and you never stopped me. I gave you chances, Miguel replied. So many chances. I thought eventually you'd learn, that you'd see what you were doing to people, but you never did. You got worse. The pool area had become a theater now, with other residents gathering at a respectful distance. Karen could feel their eyes on her, could sense the shift in the atmosphere. Some looked confused, others shocked. A few seemed to be putting pieces together, their faces showing the same dawning horror she felt. Mrs. Chen, Miguel called out to an elderly Asian woman who'd been swimming laps. Would you like to tell Mrs. Matthews about the complaint she filed regarding your morning Tai Chi practice? The woman's kind face hardened. She said my foreign exercise routine was inappropriate for a family community. She wanted it banned from the common areas. Karen's chest tightened. She remembered that complaint. The woman had been doing her exercises at dawn, silent and graceful, disturbing no one, but it had looked foreign, different, wrong somehow. The Rodriguez family, Miguel continued relentlessly. You tried to ban their quinceañera celebration because it was too ethnic for the community standards you'd established. The Kim family's Korean barbecue gatherings, Elena added. You said the smells were overwhelming and might affect property values. Each name, each incident, fell like stones into Karen's chest. She could see the pattern now, blazing in her mind like neon signs. Every family she'd targeted, every rule she'd pushed through, every standard she'd established, they all had one thing in common. They were all designed to keep people who looked different, sounded different, or lived differently from feeling welcome in her perfect little world. Oh God, she whispered, the full weight of her actions crashing down on her. I didn't mean to. Didn't mean to what? Miguel's voice was steel now. Didn't mean to drive away every family that didn't fit your narrow definition. Of acceptable? Didn't mean to turn my community into a place where people feel unwelcome in their own homes? Karen's phone buzzed on the concrete where she'd dropped it. A text from her neighbor. Emergency HOA meeting tonight? What's the crisis? Now? She stared at the message, remembering how proud she'd been of her proactive leadership, how she'd convinced herself that her vigilance was protecting everyone's investment. The meeting tonight, she said, her voice barely audible. I called an emergency meeting to address the pool situation. Miguel's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. And what exactly were you planning to address? Karen's throat closed. She couldn't repeat the words she'd been preparing, the passionate speech about maintaining community standards and preventing undesirable elements from taking advantage of their facilities. She started, then stopped. The truth was too ugly to speak aloud. You were going to try to ban my family from the pool, Miguel said flatly. The pool that sits on my land, funded by my development costs, maintained by my property management company. The silence stretched between them, like a chasm. Karen could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the sweat beating on her forehead despite the afternoon heat. What happens now? She asked, and she hated how small her voice sounded. Miguel studied her for a long moment, and Karen saw something, In his expression, that was somehow worse than anger. Disappointment. Deep, bone-weary disappointment. "Now," he said, "you're going to learn what accountability looks like." He turned to address the growing crowd of residents. "There will indeed be an emergency meeting tonight. 7 o'clock community center. And Mrs. Matthews is going to have a very different presentation than the one she'd planned." Karen's world tilted again. But this time, it felt less like falling, and more like sinking. Because she was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about a pool confrontation or a case of mistaken identity. This was about 8 years of choices, 8 years of building a kingdom on someone else's land while systematically destroying the very community she'd claimed to protect. And Miguel Herrera, the man she just tried to have thrown out of his own property, was about to show her exactly what justice looked like. The Willowbrook Estates Community Center had never felt smaller. Karen sat in the front row, her usual position of authority now feeling like a prisoner's dock. Behind her, the room buzzed with nervous energy as residents filed in, their conversations dying to whispers when they spotted her rigid posture and pale complexion. She'd spent the 3 hours since the pool confrontation in her kitchen, staring at her lease agreement through a magnifying glass like a desperate detective. Every clause she'd previously ignored now blazed with terrifying clarity. The property management structure, the landowner's ultimate authority, the carefully worded sections about community governance, it was all there, hidden in plain sight. Her hands shook as she remembered calling her real estate agent from 8 years ago, demanding answers. The woman had been confused at first, then increasingly uncomfortable as Karen's questions grew more frantic. "Of course you're renting, Karen. We discussed this extensively. The owner preferred long-term leases to sales in order to maintain community cohesion. You said it was perfect because you wouldn't have to worry about property taxes or major maintenance issues." Karen had hung up feeling like she was drowning in her own delusions. How had she convinced herself she was a homeowner? How had she built an entire identity around owning property she'd never actually purchased? The answer was as humbling as, it was pathetic. She'd wanted it to be true so desperately that she'd rewritten reality in her own mind. Now, as residents continued to stream into the meeting room, Karen could feel their curious and increasingly hostile stares. Word had spread quickly through the community's gossip network, though she suspected most people still didn't understand the full scope of what had happened. Is it true what they're saying? Margaret Walsh, her former ally in the HOA's more aggressive policies, slid into the seat beside her. About the pool incident? Karen couldn't meet her eyes. It's complicated. People are saying you harassed the Herrera family, that you tried to have them arrested for using the pool. Margaret's tone was carefully neutral, but Karen could hear the underlying concern. Margaret had been with her on many of the community improvements over the years. "I thought they were trespassing," Karen whispered, her voice barely audible. "But Karen, the Herreras have lived here for 3 years. Miguel helped my husband fix our sprinkler system last summer. Elena brought us soup when I had the flu." The words hit Karen like individual slaps. 3 years. The Herrera family had been part of this community for 3 years, and she'd never bothered to learn who they were. She'd seen Miguel around the neighborhood countless times, but had dismissed him as just another maintenance worker or contractor. The tragic irony was crystallizing. While she'd been obsessing over every detail of community governance, she'd failed to actually know her community. "There she is," someone whispered near the back of the room, and Karen turned to see Miguel entering with his family. He'd changed into a crisp button-down shirt and slacks, and Elena wore a simple but elegant dress. They looked like what they were, respectable residents attending a community meeting. The room's energy shifted immediately. Some residents nodded respectfully to the Herreras, while others watched with the fascinated horror of people witnessing a car crash. Miguel's presence commanded attention in a way that Karen's authority never had. It was natural, unforced, based on genuine respect rather than fear. Karen's stomach clenched as she watched him interact with other residents. Mrs. Chen gave Elena a warm hug. The Johnson family, who Karen now remembered had moved back to the community 6 months ago, greeted Miguel like an old friend. Even the teenagers clustered around Mateo, clearly considering him part of their social circle. How had she missed all of this? How had she been so blind to the actual relationships that made up her community? Miguel caught her eye from across the room and nodded slightly. Not friendly, but not hostile either. The gesture somehow made Karen feel worse than outright anger would have. At exactly 7 o'clock, Miguel walked to the front of the room. He didn't need to call for attention. The conversations died naturally as people recognized that something significant was about to happen. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice carrying easily through the space. "I know this meeting was called under unusual circumstances, and I appreciate you all taking the time to be here." Karen's chest tightened. She was supposed to be running this meeting. This was her role, her responsibility, but she felt frozen in her chair, unable to move or speak. "For those who don't know me well," Miguel continued, "my name is Miguel Herrera. My family and I have been part of this community for 3 years, and before that, I spent 4 years developing this property and establishing the infrastructure that makes Willowbrook Estates possible." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Many residents were clearly hearing this information for the first time. "This afternoon, there was an incident at the community pool that I believe requires community discussion. Mrs. Matthews, would you like to explain what happened from your perspective?" All eyes turned to Karen. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a bug under a microscope. Her mouth opened and closed several times before any sound emerged. There was a misunderstanding," she managed. "A misunderstanding," Miguel repeated neutrally. "Could you be more specific?" Karen's hands were shaking visibly now. She could feel the weight of the community's attention, could sense that some people already knew more than they were letting on. I believed that your family might not be authorized to use the pool facilities," she said, each word feeling like swallowing glass. "And what gave you that impression?" Miguel's tone remained conversational, but there was steel underneath. This was it, the moment where she'd have to confront the ugly truth in front of everyone. Karen looked around the room, seeing faces she'd known for years. People who'd elected her to represent their interests, who'd trusted her judgment, who'd followed her lead on dozens of community decisions. "I didn't recognize you," she whispered, then forced herself to speak louder. "I didn't recognize your family, and I made assumptions." "What kind of assumptions?" Elena asked quietly from the back of the room. Her voice was gentle, but the question cut like a blade. Karen closed her eyes, wishing she could disappear. But there was no escape now, no way to minimize or deflect what she'd done. "I assumed you didn't belong here because—" Her voice caught. "Because you didn't look like what I thought residents should look like." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere as people processed what she'd just admitted. "Jesus, Karen," someone muttered from the middle of the room. "So let me make sure I understand," Miguel said, his voice carefully controlled. "You saw a Hispanic family enjoying the pool, and your first thought was that we must be trespassing?" Karen nodded miserably, unable to trust her voice. "Despite the fact that we've lived here for 3 years, despite the fact that we've participated in community events, helped neighbors, contributed to the very community you claim to represent." Each word landed like a physical blow. Karen wanted to defend herself, to explain that it hadn't been about race, that she'd just been protecting community standards, but even in her own mind, the justification sounded hollow and pathetic. "Mrs. Matthews," Mrs. Chen spoke up from the third row, her voice carrying decades of quiet dignity. "Last year you filed a complaint about my morning Tai Chi practice. You said it was inappropriate for a family community. Would you like to explain what you meant by that?" Karen's world was collapsing in real time. She could see where this was heading, could sense the community beginning to connect dots they'd previously ignored. "The Rodriguez quinceañera," someone else called out. "You tried to ban it because it was too ethnic." "The Washington's work truck," another voice added. "You made James Park 6 blocks away because it lowered property values." "The Patel's Diwali celebration? The Kim family's barbecue gatherings. the music from the Johnson baby's baptism. The voices were building now, years of suppressed frustration and hurt bubbling to the surface. Karen realized with growing horror that she was witnessing the community finally understanding the pattern of her leadership, a pattern that had systematically targeted anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision of acceptable. "Stop," she whispered, but no one could hear her over the growing murmur of angry voices. Miguel raised his hand, and the room fell silent immediately. The gesture reminded Karen painfully of how he'd commanded his family's attention at the pool, natural authority that came from respect rather than fear. "I think," Miguel said quietly, "that Mrs. Matthews is beginning to understand the impact of her actions. The question now is, what do we do about it?" Karen felt her chest constricting. She was about to lose everything, her position, her reputation, possibly even her home. But more than that, she was facing the devastating realization that she'd spent 8 years destroying the very thing she'd claimed to protect. And the worst part was, she was finally beginning to understand that she deserved whatever was coming next. Miguel let the question hang in the air for a long moment, his eyes scanning the faces of the residents who had gathered in judgment. Karen could feel the collective weight of their anger, disappointment, and betrayal pressing down on her like a physical force. "Before we discuss consequences," Miguel continued, his voice measured and deliberate, "I think the community deserves to understand the full scope of what's been happening here." He pulled out a tablet and connected it to the room's presentation screen. Karen's stomach dropped as she realized what was coming. "Over the past 3 years, I've been documenting every complaint, every rule change, every community standard that's been implemented under Mrs. Matthews' leadership." The screen flickered to life, displaying a detailed spreadsheet that made Karen's blood run cold. The noise complaint against the Chen family's Tai Chi practice, filed 3 days after Mrs. Chen helped organize the community garden that Mrs. Matthews had opposed. Mrs. Chen's face tightened with understanding. "I wondered why you suddenly had a problem with something I'd been doing for months. The parking restrictions targeting the Washington family's work truck, implemented 2 weeks after Mr. Washington publicly questioned the increased guest fees at a community meeting." James Washington stood up from the back of the room, his voice heavy with hurt. "You made me think I was disrupting the neighborhood. I felt so ashamed that I almost sold my house." Karen wanted to sink through the floor. She remembered both incidents, but she'd convinced herself they were unrelated. She'd told herself she was addressing legitimate community concerns, not targeting people who'd crossed her. "The quinceañera ban," Miguel continued relentlessly, "came after the Rodriguez family hosted a successful community-wide barbecue that raised more money for the children's playground than any HOA-organized event ever had." Maria Rodriguez stood up, tears in her eyes. "My daughter asked me why the neighborhood didn't like our culture. She was 15 years old, and she felt like she had to hide who she was in her own community." The words hit Karen like physical blows. She'd never considered the children, never thought about how her policies might affect the young people who were supposed to call this place home. "The pattern is clear," Miguel said, advancing to the next slide. Every family that was targeted had one thing in common. They either looked different, celebrated different traditions, or had the audacity to question Mrs. Matthews' authority. The data on the screen was damning. Complaint after complaint. Rule after rule, all targeting the same demographic groups. Karen had been so focused on individual incidents that she'd never seen the forest for the trees. But displayed like this, her bias was undeniable. 37 families, Miguel said, quietly. 37 families have moved out of Willowbrook Estates in the past 3 years due to what they described as a hostile community environment. That's a turnover rate of nearly 60%. The number hit the room like a thunderclap. Karen could see residents doing mental calculations, remembering neighbors who'd left, putting together pieces they'd previously ignored. "The community has been hemorrhaging diversity," Elena added, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. "When we moved here, this neighborhood was vibrant, multicultural, full of different perspectives and traditions. Under Mrs. Matthews' leadership, it's become increasingly homogeneous and economically stratified," Miguel continued. The guest fees, parking restrictions, and celebration permits haven't just targeted cultural differences, they've systematically excluded working class, families who couldn't afford the additional costs. Margaret Walsh, Karen's former ally, stood up with a stricken expression. Karen, is this true? Have we been discriminating? Karen looked at Margaret, really looked at her, and saw her own horror reflected back. Margaret was a good person, someone who genuinely believed they were improving the community. The realization that they'd been used as instruments of exclusion was written clearly across her face. I never meant, Karen started, then stopped. The words sounded pathetic even to her own ears. Didn't mean what? The voice came from Sarah, Kim, whose family had been targeted for their traditional Korean barbecue gatherings. Didn't mean to make my children feel unwelcome at their own home? Didn't mean to cost me thousands of dollars in moving expenses? James Washington's voice was rising now, years of suppressed anger finally finding release. Didn't mean to make my elderly mother cry because she felt like her morning exercises were shameful? Mrs. Chen's usual gentle demeanor had hardened into something Karen had never seen before. The voices were building again, but this time Karen could hear the pain behind the anger. These weren't abstract policy decisions. They were real people whose lives she'd made smaller, whose sense of belonging she'd systematically eroded. I was trying to protect property values, she said desperately, grasping for any justification that might make sense. I was trying to maintain standards that would benefit everyone. Whose standards? Miguel asked, and the question cut through Karen's defenses like a laser. Standards that say morning Tai Chi is inappropriate? Standards that say quinceañeras are too ethnic? Standards that say work trucks lower property values but luxury SUVs don't? Karen had no answer because there was no answer. Her standards had been arbitrary, biased, designed to exclude rather than include. The truth is, Miguel continued, property values have actually declined under your leadership. The high turnover rate, the reputation for being unwelcoming, the lack of community cohesion, all of these factors have made Willowbrook Estates less desirable, not more. He clicked to another slide showing comparative real estate data. Neighboring communities with strong diversity and active cultural programming have seen property values increase by an average of 12% over the past 3 years. Willowbrook has seen a decline of 3%. The numbers were devastating. Karen had convinced herself she was protecting everyone's investment, but she'd actually been damaging it. Her policies hadn't just been morally wrong, they'd been economically disastrous. So what happens now? Someone called out from the back of the room. Miguel looked directly at Karen, and she saw something in his expression that was somehow worse than anger, pity. That's up to the community, he said. But I want everyone to understand something. As the landowner, I have certain legal authorities that supersede the HOA's governance structure. I've chosen not to exercise those authorities because I believe in community self-determination. But that doesn't mean I'll continue to tolerate systematic discrimination on my property. The implication was clear. Karen could lose more than just her HOA position. She could lose her home. Mrs. Matthews, he continued, you have a choice to make. You can continue to pretend that your actions were justified, that you were just maintaining standards and protecting the community, or you can acknowledge the harm you've caused and work to repair it. Karen felt tears burning her eyes. The room was silent now, waiting for her response. She could feel the weight of 8 years of choices, 8 years of building walls instead of bridges, 8 years of mistaking fear for leadership. She began, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know how to fix this. That's the first honest thing you've said tonight, Elena said quietly, and there was something in her tone that might have been compassion. Miguel nodded slowly. Acknowledging the problem is the first step, but acknowledgement without action is just more empty words. He looked around the room, making eye contact with resident after resident. This community has a decision to make. Do we want to continue down the path of exclusion and decline, or do we want to build something better? Karen realized that her fate wasn't just in Miguel's hands. It was in the hands of every person in this room. People she'd governed, People she'd excluded, people she'd hurt. And for the first time in 8 years, she was going to have to face the consequences of her choices without the armor of authority to protect her. The reckoning she'd been dreading was finally here, and she was about to learn whether a community she'd nearly destroyed was capable of something she'd never shown them: mercy. The silence in the community center stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment. Karen could feel every eye in the room boring into her, waiting for her response to Miguel's ultimatum. Her hands trembled in her lap as she struggled to find words that could possibly bridge the chasm she'd spent 8 years creating. "I need to resign," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "As HOA president, effective immediately." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but it wasn't the satisfaction she'd expected. If anything, people seemed more uncomfortable, as if her resignation was too little, too late. "That's a start," Miguel said neutrally, "but resignation without restitution is just running away." Karen looked up at him, seeing her own reflection in his dark eyes. "What do you want from me?" "It's not about what I want," Miguel replied. "It's about what this community needs to heal." James Washington stood up from the back of the room, his tall frame commanding attention. "You want to make things right? Start by calling every family you drove away. Apologize. Tell them what really happened here. Some of them lost money on moving costs," Maria Rodriguez added, her voice thick with emotion. "The Garcias had to break their lease early. The Patels lost their security deposit when they moved out suddenly." Karen's stomach lurched. She'd never considered the financial impact of her actions on the families who'd left. In her mind, they'd simply chosen to move. She'd never connected their departures to her policies. "The Nguyen family's daughter was supposed to graduate with her class," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "She had to finish her senior year at a different school because you made them feel so unwelcome they couldn't stay." Each revelation felt like a knife twist. Karen had been so focused on her abstract concepts of community standards that she'd completely ignored the human cost of her decisions. "I'll pay," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "The moving costs, the lost deposits, whatever it takes." "With what money?" Margaret Walsh asked, though not unkindly. "Karen, you're a renter just like the rest of us. Most of us don't have thousands of dollars sitting around." The practical reality hit Karen like a cold slap. She'd been living paycheck to paycheck for years, spending most of her income on maintaining the lifestyle she thought befitted an HOA president. Designer clothes, expensive gym memberships, the kind of car she believed projected success, all of it had been funded by credit cards and financial delusion. "Then I'll get a second job," she said desperately. "I'll do whatever it takes." Elena Herrera spoke for the first time in several minutes, her voice gentle but firm. "Money isn't enough, Mrs. Matthews. Some wounds can't be healed with a check." "Then what?" Karen asked, and she could hear the desperation creeping into her. "Oh, tell me what to do, please." Miguel exchanged a look with his wife, some silent communication passing between them. When he turned back to Karen, his expression was unreadable. "3 conditions," he said. "Non-negotiable." Karen nodded frantically, ready to agree to anything. "First, you will personally contact every family that left Willowbrook Estates in the past 3 years. You will explain what happened, take full responsibility, and offer a genuine apology. Not a defensive explanation, not an excuse-laden justification, a real apology that acknowledges the harm you caused." Karen's throat constricted. The thought of making those calls, of facing the pain she'd caused, terrified her more than losing her home. But she nodded. "Second, you will work with the property management company to establish a community fund for anti-discrimination education and cultural celebration programming. The fund will be seeded with your own money, whatever you can contribute, and you will personally organize fundraising efforts to grow it." "How much?" Karen asked weakly. "Start with whatever you were planning to spend on your next car payment," Miguel said dryly. "Consider it an investment in becoming a better person." The comment stung because it was accurate. Karen had been planning to upgrade her lease to a luxury SUV, another symbol of the status she'd been so desperate to maintain. "Third, Miguel continued, his voice growing harder. You will attend mandatory diversity and inclusion training, not a weekend seminar, not an online course. Real, comprehensive education about unconscious bias, systemic discrimination, and community building. And you'll complete 100 hours of community service working with organizations that support the communities you've harmed. Karen felt the weight of those conditions settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. It would take months, maybe years, to fulfill them all. It would require her to fundamentally examine and change who she was as a person. And if I do all of that? She asked. If you do all of that, Miguel said slowly, and if the community agrees, you can stay in your home. But you'll never hold an HOA position again, and any future community involvement will be subject to oversight. What kind of oversight? Elena stepped forward. A committee of residents you've previously targeted will review any proposals you want to make. They'll have veto power over anything that might impact community inclusivity. The irony wasn't lost on Karen. The people she'd tried to exclude would now have authority over her participation in community life. It was poetic justice of the most humbling kind. There's something else, Mrs. Chen said, her voice carrying an unexpected note of steel. We want the full HOA records, every complaint, every rule change, every decision made in the past 8 years. Complete transparency. Karen's blood chilled. Those records contained things she'd hoped would never see the light of day. Personal vendettas disguised as policy decisions, complaints she'd filed under false pretenses, communications that revealed the full extent of her bias. Some of those records are confidential, she said weakly. Not anymore, Miguel replied. Transparency is the only way this community can move forward. People have a right to know how they've been governed. Karen looked around the room, seeing faces that had once looked to her for leadership now waiting to see if she had the courage to take responsibility for her failures. The magnitude of what was being asked of her was overwhelming. I need time. To think, she said. No. The voice came from Mateo Herrera, Miguel's teenage son. You had 8 years to think, 8 years to do the right thing. We're not giving you more time to figure out how to wiggle out of this. The boy's words cut deeper than any adult condemnation could have. Here was a kid who'd grown up watching her systematically exclude people who looked like his family, and his anger was pure and justified. Mateo, Miguel said quietly, but his son shook his head. No, Papa. She needs to hear this. He turned to face Karen directly. You made my friends feel like they didn't belong here. You made their parents question whether they were welcome in their own homes. You made kids like me wonder if we'd ever be accepted anywhere. Karen felt tears spilling down her cheeks. She'd never thought about the children, never considered that her adult conflicts might trickle down to affect young people who just wanted to feel safe in their community. You're right, she whispered. You're absolutely right. She stood up on shaking legs, feeling every eye in the room tracking her movement. I accept all of it. The conditions, the oversight, the transparency. I accept responsibility for what I've done. The room remained silent, but Karen could sense a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Not forgiveness, that would take much longer to earn, but perhaps the faintest possibility of it. The first phone call, Miguel said quietly. You'll make it tonight before you leave this building. Mrs. Rodriguez, would you be willing to contact the Garcia family and let them know Mrs. Matthews will be calling? Maria Rodriguez nodded slowly, though her expression remained guarded. Miguel handed Karen his phone. Their number is in my contacts. Start with the family you hurt most recently and work your way back. Karen took the phone with trembling hands, staring at the screen as if it might bite her. This was it. The first step toward either redemption or the complete destruction of any remaining shred of dignity she had left. But as she looked around the room one more time, seeing the faces of people she'd failed so completely, she realized that dignity was a luxury she could no longer afford. The only thing left was the truth, and the slim hope that a community could be rebuilt on the foundation of her acknowledging how thoroughly she'd helped tear it down. 6 months later, Karen's hands were stained with mulch and her back ached from hours of planting, but for the first time in years, she felt something that might have been peace. The community garden stretched before her, a vibrant tapestry of vegetables, herbs, and flowers tended by families from a dozen different cultures. It had been Elena Herrera's idea, funded by the Diversity and Inclusion Fund that Karen had helped establish. "Mrs. Matthews, could you help me with the tomatoes?" Karen looked up to see Lily Patel, the 8-year-old daughter of the family she'd once tried to silence with noise complaints about their Diwali celebrations. The little girl held a watering can almost as big as she was, her face serious with the responsibility of plant care. "Of course, sweetheart," Karen said, rising from her knees and brushing dirt from her jeans. The casual clothes still felt strange after years of maintaining her HOA president image, but they were practical for the community service work that had become the center of her new life. As she helped Lily water the tomato plants, Karen reflected on how much had changed since that catastrophic day at the pool. The phone calls had been the hardest part, 37 conversations where she'd had to listen to the pain she'd caused without defending herself, without making excuses. Some families had hung up on her, others had screamed, a few had cried, but some had listened. "Karen, the Garcia family wants to speak with you," Maria Rodriguez had said after the third call. "They're considering moving back." That conversation had lasted 2 hours. Carmen Garcia had been 6 months pregnant when Karen's harassment had forced them to move, and they'd lost their entire support system at a time when they'd needed it most. Karen had listened to every detail, had felt the weight of each consequence, and had somehow found the courage to keep listening when every instinct told her to run away from the magnitude of her failures. "The education classes," Karen said, now to Lily as they moved to the next row of plants, "taught me something important. Do you know what unconscious bias means?" Lily shook her head, her dark eyes serious and curious. "It means when your brain makes decisions about people before you really know them. I was doing that a lot before I learned better." It was a simplified explanation, but Karen had learned to speak honestly about her mistakes, even to children. Especially to children, because they would inherit whatever community she helped build now. The classes had been brutal. 24 weeks of confronting the systems and assumptions that had shaped her worldview. She'd sat in circles with other people who'd caused harm, some intentionally, some not, and had learned to recognize the difference between impact and intent. Her intentions might not have been malicious, but the impact had been devastating. "Ms. Karen!" The voice belonged to David Washington, James's 12-year-old son, who came running across the garden with dirt-streaked cheeks and excitement radiating from every pore. "Come see what we found." Karen followed him to the far corner of the garden, where a group of children from various families had gathered around something in the soil. She marveled at the easy integration, kids who might never have been friends under her old regime now working and playing together naturally. "Look," David pointed to a small patch where green shoots were emerging from the earth. "The Unity Garden is growing!" The Unity Garden had been Mateo Herrera's idea, a section where children from different families had planted seeds from their cultural traditions. Tomatoes from the Rodriguez family's Mexican heritage, herbs from the Kim family's Korean cooking, flowers that Mrs. Chen had brought from her grandmother's garden in Taiwan. "That's beautiful," Karen said, and meant it. "You're all growing something that didn't exist before." "Just like the community," said Sofia Garcia, who had indeed moved back with her family 3 months ago. Her mother Carmen still watched Karen, with careful eyes, but she'd agreed to let Sofia participate in the garden project. Karen's throat tightened with emotion. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. They were all growing something new from the broken soil of what had come before. "Mrs. Matthews," a familiar voice called from behind her. Karen turned to see Miguel approaching, Elena beside him. Even now, 6 months later, seeing them still caused a flutter of anxiety in her chest. Not fear exactly, but the complicated emotions of someone who owed a debt she might never fully repay. "Miguel, Elena," she said, straightening up and brushing her hands clean. "How are the morning Tai Chi classes going?" Elena smiled, a real smile, though still somewhat reserved. "Mrs. Chen says we have 12 regular participants now, people from all over the neighborhood." the Tai Chi classes had been another reconciliation project. After Karen's public apology to Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman had surprised everyone by proposing to teach the gentle exercise to anyone interested. It had become a morning ritual that brought neighbors together in the pre-dawn quiet. "That's wonderful," Karen said. "And the Quinceañera Planning Committee?" "Maria says they've received inquiries from 3 other neighborhoods," Miguel replied. "Your fundraising efforts have been effective." Karen felt a small surge of pride, though she tried to keep it in perspective. Organizing fundraisers was hardly heroic work. It was the bare minimum of what she owed this community. "I have news," Miguel continued, his expression becoming more serious. "The Nguyen family wants to move back." Karen's heart skipped. The Nguyens had been one of her cruelest targets, a young family with a daughter who'd been forced to change schools in her senior year because of the hostile environment Karen had created. "What did you tell them?" "That the decision isn't mine to make," Miguel said. "It's the community's and yours." "Mine?" Elena nodded. "They want to meet with you first, to see if the changes are real." Karen felt the familiar weight of accountability settling on her shoulders. Every family that considered returning, every neighbor who decided whether to trust the community again, would ultimately be judging whether her transformation was genuine. "When?" she asked. "Next week. Saturday afternoon, here in the garden." Karen nodded, then looked around at the children still tending their plants, at the evidence of growth and cooperation that had emerged from the wreckage of her leadership. She thought about the diversity training sessions where she'd learned to recognize her biases, the community service hours spent working with immigrant families, the monthly oversight meetings where former targets of her discrimination reviewed, her community involvement. It had been the hardest year of her life, but also the most honest. "I'll be here," she said simply. As Miguel and Elena walked away, Karen returned to her planting. The sun was setting over Willowbrook Estates, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the community pool in the distance. The same pool where her world had shattered 6 months ago. But now, as she watched families from a dozen different backgrounds working together in the garden they'd built on the foundation of her failures, Karen realized that sometimes the most beautiful things grew from the most broken soil. She still had a long way to go. Trust was earned in drops and lost in buckets, and she was still very much in the earning phase. Some neighbors might never forgive her. Some damage might be irreparable. But for the first time in her adult life, Karen Matthews was building something instead of tearing it down, and in the laughter of children who saw each other as friends rather than threats, in the morning Tai Chi circles that welcomed everyone, in the quinceañeras that celebrated culture instead of hiding it, she could see the possibility of redemption, not absolution. She didn't deserve that. But the chance to spend the rest of her life proving that people could change, that communities could heal, and that even the worst mistakes could become the foundation for something better. As Lily Patel tugged on her sleeve to show her a butterfly that had landed on the Unity Garden, Karen smiled and knelt down to admire the small miracle of beauty emerging from soil that had once seemed too damaged to grow anything at all. So, pool still shimmered in the distance, but now it reflected not just the sky, but the possibility of a community where everyone truly belonged.